Good evening. My name is Victoria Tishman Camerzell. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am speaking to you from Livermore, California. I want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Confederated Villages of Lishan. I am going to ask that you please mute your mic if you have not done so already and save all questions for the end of the presentation. Our presenter tonight is Golden State Salmon Association President John McManus. John is a longtime salmon fisherman and salmon advocate. He comes from a varied background that includes 10 years of commercial salmon fishing in southeastern Alaska, 15 years producing news for CNN, and more recently, 11 years doing publicity and organizing for the public interest environmental law firm Earth Justice. A San Francisco native, Muni Pier and Lake Merced were the places where he first learned to tie a fishing line, bait a hook, and cast. He's a longtime member of the Coastside Fishing Club and keeps a boat part of the year in Half Moon Bay and on the Marin, Sonoma, and Mendocino coast. From the 1970s on, he spent a lot of time in the North Coast salmon communities of Bodega Bay, Point Arena, Fort Bragg, and Eureka. As salmon runs declined in the 1990s, he got a front row seat to the demise of these fishing communities, something that fuels his advocacy for salmon and salmon communities to this day. I want to thank John for being here with us this evening, and now I will turn the presentation over to him.
Thank you, Victoria. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, folks. I'm John McManus. I'm the president of the Golden State Salmon Association, as Victoria just said. We represent both recreational and sport salmon fishermen and women, as well as related businesses like the tackle manufacturers, marine electronics, boat yards, etc., and salmon fishing communities all up and down the coast and the interior of California. We're closely allied with conservation groups, including Earth Justice, NRDC, and others. Our mission is to restore California salmon for their economic, recreational, commercial, environmental, cultural, and health values. We work to do this by working on hydrology, habitat, and hatcheries. So take a look for a sec at this map. The orange here shows you the range of king salmon in the northwest part of the continent. You can see that king salmon go all the way up to Alaska, up above the Bering Sea. But notice the southern edge of this orange map, and you'll see it's down here in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is the furthest south that you'll find king salmon that come out of the Central Valley, and every one of them comes and goes underneath the Golden Gate Bridge. Salmon live in both fresh and salt water. I think folks know that. And as I just said, all Central Valley salmon funnel in and out under this bridge. We care primarily about Central Valley salmon because they're the biggest runs that supply the industry, that supply the fishery. Central Valley salmon comprise up to 60% of what's taken off the Oregon coast, basically north of 95% of what's taken off our California coast in terms of salmon. These are the rivers and tributaries that we focus our efforts on. If you stop for a minute and take a look at the map and notice the stars, that'll show you where salmon hatcheries are. From the south to the north, you'll notice there's one on the Merced River. There's one on the McCollum River. There's one on the American River. There's one on the Feather River. There's one on Battle Creek, which is a major tributary of the upper Sacramento. And that very top star is the Livingston Stone National Fish Hatchery. It's located right at the base of Shasta Dam. We want to talk a little bit tonight about drought and climate. We lost most of what little natural populations we had in the last drought, and it's happening again now. The reason is that when water temperatures exceed 54.5 degrees, salmon eggs, which are buried in the gravel, are lost. And unfortunately, we've had temperatures on the spawning grounds throughout the Central Valley, certainly last year, and it's fairly certain it's going to happen again this year, that are going to exceed 54.4. This is one of the things that's taken down our natural runs. Here's a picture from last June showing winter run king salmon dying in the upper Sacramento River in June. You'll notice the white on these salmon. It's a fungal disease, I think, that's starting to set in because their immune systems are impaired. They can't fight off the hot water. These fish were dying before they were able to spawn. The bigger problem, like I referred to earlier, is after spawning when the eggs are in the gravel and the water gets too hot. And it has everything to do with how water is managed in Lake Shasta, when the releases occur, how much water is released. And unfortunately, here in California, where 80% of the water goes to agriculture, the releases coming out of these dams on salmon rivers are generally timed to provide the greatest benefit to agriculture and not to salmon. But one of the things I want to touch on tonight is things we could think about going forward as we look at climate change. This is the Monticello Dam, and it dams Puda Creek. What I wanted to point out in this photo is look down at the bottom, and there's a white thing that kind of looks like a straw sticking out of the dam. It's actually a hole through the dam. And the water coming out of the reservoir upstream all comes out of the bottom of the dam through that pipe. This is a little unusual. This dam is not set up to generate electricity. If it were, it would have turbines built into the dam at higher elevations. But because they don't really care about electrical generation, they can afford to release all the water out the bottom. What it means is the deeper you go in the reservoir on the uphill side of this dam, the colder it gets. So this water coming out of the bottom of this dam is actually quite cold. It's about 55 degrees all year round, which is good for salmon. This is a shot of the Oroville Dam on the Feather River. You can't see it from this picture, but it also has a similar pipe going through the bottom of the dam. However, that's not normally how they release water through this dam. They release water through this dam at a higher elevation. They run it through turbines, and it tends to be a little bit warmer. Last year, because Lake Oroville was so low, they were unable to run water through the turbines, and they were forced to use the drain plug in the very bottom of the dam. They actually call it a river valve. And so on the Feather River last year, at least for the upper part of the Feather, you had water coming out of Oroville. It was 47 degrees, believe it or not. It was great for the salmon. And it's an irony that it's happening in drought just because the lake level gets too low to feed the pen stocks and the turbines. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is some work that's just starting to happen now to mimic some of the actions being taken in Oregon and Washington to capture adult salmon, put them in a truck, a tanker truck like the one you're seeing here, and moving them up above the dams and releasing them where they can spawn in colder waters up in the foothills of the Sierra, or even a little higher than the foothills of the Sierra. There's still good salmon habitat up there above these dams if you get far enough up, certainly on the North Fork of the Feather River and above Shasta up in the McCloud River. There's cold water. And again, I want to point to Battle Creek here, way up at the top here. This is one of the areas where, in fact, Battle Creek is primarily fed from spring melt from Mount Shasta and Lassen, and that stuff's cold all through the summer. So this year they're going to be trapping federally endangered winter run king salmon and moving them up above where that star is, showing you where the hatchery is. There's a dam right there at the hatchery. They're going to move them up into the upper part of Battle Creek and release them. It's expected those fish will successfully lay eggs. Those eggs will successfully hatch. But then the next trick is, what do you do with the juveniles as they come downstream? Well, in the case of Battle Creek, they're actually free to swim right back downstream and into the Sacramento River. But if we go up into the McCloud River, which is above Lake Shasta, those juveniles would be forced to swim down the McCloud and into Lake Shasta Once they get into the lake, they're done. They need a strong current pushing them ever downstream. And in the lake, of course, they'd lose that. They'd have a hard time figuring out which way to go. So what I'm showing you here is some fish collection devices designed for juvenile salmon. This is one from Washington State. And in the future, we may see these things put in place here in California if we start moving adult salmon up above the dams, capturing them and moving them back downstream. I want to go back to this picture here. This is actually a shot of that hose is hooked up to a tanker truck. The tanker truck is full of small fish that were born in a hatchery, actually. And those fish are about 3 or 4 inches long. And they drove that truck way up Battle Creek, up into the headwaters, and they released them. And the reason they did it is they're hoping these fish will imprint on the upper waters of Battle Creek. They imprint by a combination of smell, the chemical smell of upper Battle Creek, and they also have basically little GPS units built into their brains, or actually in the case of salmon, it may be that it's built into their scales, believe it or not. But between their smell and their GPS sense, they can find their way back. So there's an effort here to release fish so they will purposely home back as adults to Battle Creek. Another thing that we're working on that can help some of the drought effects has to do with how these fish come down the Sacramento River. Getting down the Sacramento River is tricky business these days if you're a juvenile salmon. They're lousy swimmers. They don't swim down to the delta and bay. They get flushed down. They evolved to basically hitch a ride on runoff, snow melt in the springtime as it came down off the Sierras in the past. But of course, these days, that snow melt's being trapped behind these dams. So too often in the Sacramento River, we don't have adequate flows in the springtime to get these juveniles downstream. And it becomes a real problem down below the Fremont Weir there at Verona, and even down below Sacramento. And the reason why is when these juveniles get down into the interior delta, that maze of gold that kind of looks like tree roots, if they don't have enough flow pushing them down the natural course of the Sacramento River, they can be pulled off sides into the interior delta, and they become food for predatory fish. So what's being shown here, the pink that kind of looks like Pepto-Bismol there, is the yellow bypass. And up at Verona, there's a very small dam. It's only about 3 feet high. And when the Sacramento River floods, that dam, the Fremont Weir is the dam, it overtops and allows all that flood water to flow down through the yellow bypass all the way down to about Rio Vista, basically down to a safe part. If you're juvenile salmon and you get flushed through the yellow bypass, you pop out the bottom, you're in pretty good shape. So there's the yellow bypass when it's flooded. This picture was taken in 2017. For people who were here then, you recall that it really rained cats and dogs in 2017. And that's the yellow causeway with the cars going between Davis and Sacramento. And that remained like that for months, actually, in 2017. There's juvenile salmon in that water, safely moving down and out. So the work right now is lowering the Fremont Weir to allow this to happen more often, even when the Sacramento is not flooding. I want to talk about something else that the Golden State Salmon Association has worked on just in this past year with the Coleman National Fish Hatchery, the one up there in Battle Creek. Part of the concern with hatchery fish right now is that 25% need to be marked and tagged so they can be accounted for as adults when they come back. What does that mean? It means the adipose fin gets clipped off on the fish. Right in front of this person's right thumb is the adipose fin. You can see that dinky little fin. The fish doesn't actually need it. So if you whack that off when they're juveniles and put a little teeny tiny tag in their snout, it's a little piece of stainless steel wire with numbers etched into it. Then when they come back as adults, if you get a fish that's missing its adipose fin, you can recover the snout, recover the tag, figure out where it was born, where it was released, what year it was released, etc. You get valuable data. But the problem is, in order to tag and mark these fish, they have to be about 3 or 4 inches long. And by that time, often we're into April. And by that time, in California today, the flows have already started to recede in the Sacramento River. So what if we could get these fish out into the water earlier in the year? Well, it turns out the good news is in 2022, in addition to whacking their adipose fins and putting little stainless steel tags in their snout, we can now take a tissue sample. And we can figure out when they come back, if we take another tissue sample, where they came from. So we don't have to actually physically take their adipose and put a wire tag in them, but this is developing science right now. So that's a picture of me up at Coleman this past October, and they were working with some of the spawning adults, and we had these hole punches, and we were taking whole samples out of their tail fins that were being encoded on little pieces of paper. And these were sent up to a DNA analysis lab up in Washington State. This work is being done by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Our interest was in trying to get these little guys to a point where they could be released earlier in the year. And in fact, these little guys were released in, I want to say, it was January or February. So this is new for California, pretty much. There's been some experimental work, but we're hoping that we'll be able to increase hatchery production while at the same time introducing new DNA technology. We're making it widespread and scalable here in California. This is a shot of the truck from the hatchery with about 400,000 of these dinky little fish in it being released into the Sacramento River. That's the size of the fish. Pretty small, much smaller than what you'd need if you want to tag and clip them. So I briefly want to talk about another issue that we're confronting with climate change, and that is we've got worse outbreaks of parasitic disease in the rivers. This shows a parasite that will infect juvenile salmon and kill them. It can be widespread in the Klamath River, but in recent years, we've also found that this parasite is in the Feather River and the Sacramento River, and it gets a lot worse when flows are low. When flows are high and cold, this parasite gets beaten back. Low, warm flows, the parasite proliferates, attacks the juvenile salmon, and we lose a lot of them. These are some of the fish that were recovered that were all ridden with these parasites this past year in a sampling up in the Klamath River. This is a shot of one of the tanker trucks carrying these 4-inch fish down to the Feather River to release them. Golden State Salmon Association has been in a tug of war with the state over this practice, pointing out that, listen, if it's a high flow year, okay, go ahead and release them there. But in a low flow year, why don't you keep the trucks on the highway and drive them a little further south so they can get out of these parasitic ridden waters. So I want to change topics here for a second and give a great shout out to the Bay chapter that we're partnering with, working to get the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission to do its part on Tuolumne River diversions. Why? Well, this graph is from 2015, but it could be almost any year when we don't have really big rains. In fact, we probably saw a very similar graph this year. The black line shows you what little rain we got. You can see we got a couple of spikes. Even in a drought year, we got a couple of spikes. The red line down below shows you of the water that fell into the watershed, what was allowed to flow unimpaired downstream. And you can see they captured the vast majority of the water that fell in the watershed. Very, very little was allowed to flow downstream. This is on the Tuolumne, where San Francisco gets its water from. And we share that with that water with the Modesto Irrigation District and the Turlock Irrigation Districts. And believe it or not, those are both agricultural water districts, and they have senior water rights to San Francisco. So San Francisco basically is the tail of the dog and goes along with whatever those big ag water districts want to do. The state in December of 2018 said that all three of them, SFPUC, MID, and TID, need to release up to 40% unimpaired flow down the Tuolumne. And all three of those water districts turned around and sued the state, and that's still tied up in court. So we've created this effort with allies, including the Sierra Club. Thank you very much. Bill Martin has been a wonderful help on this, as well as NRDC, the Tuolumne River Trust, and others. And this is a sample of one of the advertisements that we put out to address the problem. Yosemite's River, the Tuolumne, supplies San Francisco with the best drinking water in the world. San Francisco and Yosemite's River is dying. Yosemite's River because, again, the Tuolumne originates in Yosemite. Large ag water districts downstream are taking too much, and they are, leaving a stagnant wasteland in the delta infested with invasive species. There's more damage than that, but we chose to focus in on this particular harm. SFPUC is abetting this. Why? SFPUC could save San Francisco and Yosemite's River. Ask Mayor Breed to get the SFPUC to do its part. Well, if only Mayor Breed would stick her nose into this and figure out water stuff, but I think she's delegated that to others. So I want to move on to another topic, and I'm getting somewhat close to the end. This has to do with the trucking of hatchery fish. I showed you earlier on where all those hatcheries were up in the Central Valley. The hatcheries have recognized for some time that the Sacramento River has become a hostile migration corridor for juvenile salmon in most years, not all years. You get wet years like 2017, 2019, go ahead, release the fish right at the hatchery, don't worry about it. But in, unfortunately, the vast majority of years, there are low flows in the Sacramento River in the springtime. You release the fish into those low flows, we will lose them. You're just throwing money away. So in recognition of that, the state has been trucking fish to Mare Island in Vallejo and releasing them for, well, probably 20 years anyway, 25, 30 years maybe. We discovered through some experimentation that actually keeping the tanker trucks on the road all the way down to Sausalito and releasing the fish there doubled their survival. And in some years, it tripled and quadrupled their survival. So we've been pushing on the state, and actually in the last few years, the state has come about and they're moving more and more of their releases down into San Francisco Bay instead of San Pablo Bay, which is a great assist to the salmon industry. One of the reasons we want to keep the industry alive is not only to keep a roof over our members' heads, but also to keep a voice at the table in Sacramento and in Washington, D.C. for protecting our environment. It's a shot of some of the tanker trucks. Each of those have 100,000 to 200,000 juvenile fish in them. These guys are sitting here just waiting for the shadows to get longer and dusk to fall before they release the fish. Here's a shot of the fish being released right underneath the Golden Gate Bridge. And again, these are the ones that survive at high rates. Another site where fish are being released that's quite successful is in Half Moon Bay down in San Mateo County. And that's basically an ocean net pen, we're calling it. It's located inside of Pillar Point Harbor. But the survival rates of these fish are about as high as those released at Sausalito. We're working to increase these type of releases. Another shot of the net pen. So I'm actually at the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions if there are some.
John, it looks like we have one question in the chat so far. Elizabeth Dodge asked, how will the proposed Delta Tunnel affect salmon?
Well, the devil's in the details. The size of the aperture makes all the difference in the world. And by that, I mean, it depends on how big the pumps and the pipe are built to be. You build me a Delta tunnel that has a 6-inch pipe, we could live with it. You build me one with a 60-foot pipe, and the state pledges on a stack of Bibles they won't harm salmon, we're not buying it. What we've seen is the size of the infrastructure at the end of the day is going to govern how much water they pump through that thing. So the devil's in the details. We don't know the answer yet, but I will also say this. The State Water Resources Control Board is required by state law to review the state Delta Bay Water Quality Control Plan every 3 years. That is to take a look at the health of the ecosystem of the rivers, the Sacramento, the San Joaquin, all of their tributaries that feed the Delta and feed the Bay. And when the ecology gets out of whack, the state board is supposed to act. The state board has not acted in 25 years. Our position has been that the appropriate response to the Delta Tunnel would be for the State Water Resources Control Board, first and foremost, to do its duty, assess the ecological health of the Delta Bay, which is in steep decline, make appropriate adjustments in water diversions, and then let's have a conversation about a diversion project. Because in other words, from a science perspective, from a biological perspective, we can't really talk about how much water is available to export until the State Water Board goes through its exercise and updates the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. This is the same plan that I mentioned in December of 2018, started its work and found that on the tributaries of the San Joaquin, the state was telling them to increase flow, decrease diversions to allow flows of 40% unimpaired in the springtime months when juvenile salmon are trying to get down and out of the system. Again, rather than complying, the irrigation districts, including the SFPUC, all filed lawsuit against the state fighting this. So we got to take care of biz first. We got to do a little science. We got to make a biological, not a political calculation of what water is needed to keep the ecosystem alive. And then let's maybe have a discussion about what might be available for export. I hope that addresses the question.
And we have a number of questions in the queue. Our next one is from Richard. Is the Whoosh technology vacuum-powered pipeline for moving fish up and over dams a useful, effective, promising technology, John?
Yeah, not in California. The reason why is what we're talking about here, folks, is you get a great big fire hose with the volume of water you might shove through a fire hose. You put a salmon in that and you point it up over the top of a dam, and you might be able to shoot an adult salmon up over a dam. The idea is that the adult salmon would keep swimming upstream, find tributaries feeding into the reservoir, and successfully spawn. It might work where you have a dam that's 20, 30, 40 feet high. Here in California, our dams are massive. That dam on the Feather River, Oroville Dam, is, I want to say, 730 feet high. Shasta is over 450 feet high. So they don't make hydraulic systems that will shoot adult salmon that high.
Our next question is from Karen. Were there no other salmon here besides king, no sockeye, or others?
In California?
I believe she's saying, yes, I believe that's what her question is.
Well, so really we have king salmon in California, we have coho salmon. Having said that, salmon are wanderers, and we will have some wanderers show up from other states from time to time, including other species of salmon. So every once in a while, we'll see some chum salmon. Every once in a while, we'll see pink salmon. I would say we never see sockeye salmon, except I will tell you, I caught one once off the Marin coast, and it flabbergasted me. I would not have even known what I was looking at, except that I had fished them in Alaska. But for the most part, we have king and coho salmon here in California.
Our next question, Vallejo is building a desalination plant. Are you worried about the fish that are being released getting sucked up into the facility?
I'm sorry, in Vallejo?
Yes.
I have to say I was unaware of that. I'm aware of a desal plant. It's either in Antioch or Pittsburgh in the Delta. But I wasn't aware of one in Vallejo. Well, having said that, I got to tell you, I actually don't know the details. I don't know how they're going to take their water in. And that matters. That matters. There's ways you could have water intakes that would be largely protective of salmon. They're expensive, but it's possible. I mean, for instance, you can tunnel down underneath the water source. So you don't stick your straw straight into the water. You tunnel down and come up right smack dab in the middle of the riverbed. and you can put quite a screen on top. And in so doing, you could probably minimize any damage to salmon. They have that in some rivers here on the West Coast. But again, I don't know the details of what Vallejo is talking about.
Oh, the person who posed the question said that they were wrong. They do think it is Antioch.
Yeah, and I have to confess, I actually don't know the details there. I will say I've not heard, anybody talk about problems with their intake. But I don't know. I would imagine if there was problems, I would have heard about it by now. Some good-hearted biologist would have called and tapped us on the shoulder and put us on alert, including some who work for the state of California or the federal government and don't want to be named, but we would hear about it. And I've not heard about that.
Our next question, have you studied the conglomeration of human interventions for salmon on the Snake River drainage, along with the unsatisfactory results? If so, what lessons about the failed interventions to the major California drainages?
Yeah, so the Snake River is the biggest tributary of the Columbia River. Folks probably recognize the mighty Columbias separating Oregon from Washington. The Snake actually originates in the Rocky Mountains up in Idaho. It flows down into southeast Washington and merges with the Columbia River there. There's dams all up and down the Columbia and the Snake River. Unlike in California, when they built the dams on the Columbia River, they had the decency to put fish ladders on them so the adult fish could get back upstream. They didn't bother to do that with a single dam in California. But we're talking about the Snake. And the Snake has fish ladders too. But it turns out the fish ladders are not the problem with the Snake River. There's 4 dams on the lower Snake. They're all in southeast Washington. The ladders work, but what happens is the adults swim back up into Idaho and they spawn, and the juveniles come downstream, and they get to the first dam and they encounter a big reservoir. And it's like what I was talking about with Lake Shasta. They hit that reservoir and they hit a lake. So they're evolved to take a ride out on runoff. They're not evolved to hit still water where they don't know what direction to go. And that's what's killing them, is basically if we could push a strong current through those reservoirs on the lower Snake every spring, it would make a big difference. I will tell you that Earth Justice has litigated over this question since the early 1990s. Again and again and again, because Bonneville Power and others didn't want to lift a finger. It was kind of funny. They got in front of the same judge, and finally around 2005, the judge threw his hands up, seeing that he ruled in favor of Earth Justice and salmon advocates 3 or 4 times prior, but the federal government just refused to implement the remedy. So the judge says to Earth Justice attorneys, listen, I'm going to give you one wish. One wish. If you had one wish, what would it be? And the attorneys said, we want outflow in the spring. We want spring outflow. They call it spill up there. And to this day, there's a requirement that the dam and reservoir operators have to open the gates and allow additional spill down the Snake River every spring. It's not enough. It's much better than it was. But what really needs to happen up there is those dams need to basically come down and allow that river to restore itself. If you look at the benefit they bring to that region, they provide about 4% of the electricity for the entire Pacific Northwest. And, looking at the example here in California with solar energy, you've got to imagine that 4% can be compensated for with solar and wind, especially on the Columbia River Gorge where it howls. The wind howls upon occasion. But basically, when it comes to California and lessons learned, the basic lesson is in springtime, we need flow. In the autumn and in the late summer and into autumn, we need cold water to hatch those eggs out. The rest we can manage. If we have cold water in the fall and a little bit of flow in the spring, we're back in the game.
Looks like Richard has his hand up. Richard, I'm going to unmute you. Richard, yes, you are unmuted now.
I'm sorry, I just took my hand down. Well, I will ask John one question though. John, The Sierra Club Loma Prieta chapter filed a water rights complaint against the Santa Clara Valley Water District. And after 2 years, the state board just refused to deny it, refused to approve it, just said, we're going to ignore it. And it's like, is there no way to sue and win on public trust issues?
You know, Richard, you may be aware of the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance, that group headed up by Bill Jennings and Chris Schutz. They brought such a public trust lawsuit, and they won at least part of it. I don't know what the real world implications are, but those guys are easy to find. And if they're not, get a hold of me and I'll put you in touch. But to your point, it's really frustrating. And, you know, we're seeing it with the SFPUC. In the case of the Tuolumne River, they hired some bogus outfit consultants to do a study for them and come up with the result they wanted. And the result they wanted was, no, you don't need to release any more flow down the Tuolumne River. Just restore a little bit of habitat, dump a little bit of gravel into the river, and it'll be fine. The National Marine Fisheries Service did a peer review of this and found it was completely bogus. We took that to the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission and asked them to respond. And they've simply refused to respond. Much like what you're saying, when they hear stuff they don't want to hear, they'll just clam up. Public trust law is tough stuff, though. I mean, I say that I don't have particular expertise, but just watching from the sidelines what Jennings and Schutz et al. Have been through. It's taken for years. And, you know, is it a Pyrrhic victory? Is the remedy adequate? I don't know. But I could put you in touch with those guys and they could tell you more about that. I'm sorry that you've had that experience there.
And please go ahead and put any more questions in the chat. We probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. And while we're waiting to see if folks do have any more questions to put into the chat, John, if people do want to get in touch with you, what is the best way to get in touch?
I'm easy to find on the net. My phone number is all over there, for better or for worse. And I'm John at goldenstatesalmon.org. If people find any of this compelling, we'd like to have more members. Membership costs $35. And we have plenty of members already who have membership in both GSSA and the Sierra Club. I'm happy to report, as well as, by the way, I don't know if everybody on this Zoom meeting knows this, but Earth Justice formerly was the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund and changed its name, if I recall, in either 96 or 97. So we're related.
And we have one more question. What do you think the impact of wind turbines in the ocean will have on the salmon?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm curious about that too. I don't really know. I know that Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Association, which is the nonprofit and trade organization representing the salmon trollers here in California, is very concerned about it. But I don't know that their concerns are from a biological perspective. How these wind turbines are going to be tethered to get their electricity to the beach is an interesting question. I had assumed a few years back that all of them would run cables down to the seafloor and then those cables would run ashore. I've learned over the past year or so that for some of these turbine farms that are being discussed that are way offshore, 30 miles out or something like that, I mean, way out there in the ocean, they envision the possibility of having a network of cables that would be mid-water. They would not be on the bottom. That network could all come together to a single trunk line that would then go to the bottom and run ashore. But what it means is if you're trolling maybe for salmon 30 miles out, which isn't that common, but trolling for albacore is fairly common 30 miles out, and you're dragging hooks and lines through the water, you couldn't fish around these things. And I think that's the main concern. There have been other concerns that have been raised about the difference in upwelling we might see if we have massive wind turbine farms off our coast. The idea here is that the wind which is needed to create upwelling would be captured by these wind turbines it would basically be decreased inland side of the turbine and could potentially affect upwelling. I've heard others poo-poo that, basically saying you'd never see scale, you never see enough of them to have that type of effect. I don't know what the truth is. My guess is probably the latter. You know, it's hard to imagine there'd be enough of them to really affect upwelling, but I don't know that. And other than that, in terms of electromagnetic field that may exist around the turbines or around the network of cables underwater, it's a big unknown. Salmon are awfully sensitive to electricity. In fact, believe it or not, on the commercial boats, some of the commercial boats, they've got stainless steel wire going down and they have hooks clipped on that have baits that they're trying to catch the fish with. And some of the commercial trawlers will actually affix a wire to a little black electrical box and purposely put a current down into the water. Too much current drives the salmon away. Just the right amount reportedly will draw salmon to the wire. I've heard various reports as to whether this is fairy tales, old wives' tales, whether it really works or not, but I know some people actually do it. And I know some of the commercial trawlers swear that some boats fish better than others. And the presumption there is it may have to do with the electromagnetic field around the boat. So that whole electromagnetic thing, I have no idea what that's going to do out in the ocean. And it's not just salmon, presumably, that would be affected. I would imagine, you know, whale. I mean, all those critters out there are operating on levels that are invisible to us. And who knows? I'll stop there.
And John, we have one comment and then two last questions. Elizabeth says, excellent presentation. Thank you. Our next question is, has Bodega done any research on upwelling? They approved the leases at the Coastal Commission.
I'm sorry. What about upwelling in the Coastal Commission?
Has Bodega done any research on upwelling?
Has the DATA done any research?
Bodega.
Oh, Bodega, like Bodega Marine Lab. I'm guessing. I'm going to guess that's what it is. The UC University of California system has a big marine lab in Bodega, and I'm guessing that that's. And okay, so with that in mind, has Bodega done any research on upwelling and what?
And they the person also stated that they approved the leases at the Coastal Commission.
Actually, I don't know. I don't think if we're talking about the wind turbine farms, I don't think any of them have gotten permits yet. They're still in the dance, trying to describe the project, the environmental effects, and I don't think they're that far down the road yet.
Our last question for you. Have you and COSIDE changed your negative opinions about MLPAs?
What we're talking about here, folks, are the marine protected areas off the coast of California. We haven't actually taken an official position, but COSIDE actually did sue over the marine protected areas that were set up under the Marine Protection MLPA, Marine Life Protection Act, which came from back in the 1990s. The reason why is when the MPAs were set up, they basically banned all fishing, sport and commercial, including for migratory species. And I think the migratory species part was the big problem here. Here's what I'm talking about. When you set up an MPA, the idea is you have a no fishing zone. So you let all the sea life there proliferate as it would if it was undisturbed. And you make sure that it's undisturbed. If you're talking about the bottom of the ocean, especially with rock bottom, which is really robust in life, but even sand bottoms, then, you know, we would agree with the proposition that there's areas that you just need to leave alone. In fact, on the rocks, well, I'll leave it at that for the moment. However, getting back to the MPAs, what's the issue with catching a salmon that happens to swim into one? It's not going to die and go to the bottom and feed crabs. It's on its way back to the Central Valley to go up the river as an adult. And some of these MPAs were in areas that were formerly very rich fishing grounds. So there has been an issue about that. I think the bigger issue, to be quite honest with you, is when the MPAs were actually set up, the process felt rigged to many people. And by that, I mean, there was a foundation in Sacramento that worked with the state legislature to get the law passed, and then to set up hearings up and down the state to decide where these MPAs were going to be drawn, the boundaries would be drawn. And it was supposedly a public process that was supposed to respect public input. And some would argue that it worked as intended. Others would argue that their voices were ignored. Those who would argue that their voices would ignore, I've heard from some of them who also argued that other voices were given basically veto authority. So it's an old fight. I'll tell you where the rubber meets the road right now on the MPAs. And I think those fishing interests that were opposed got over it. They learned to live with it. But where the real issue is with the 30 by 30 state proposition that's moving forward. Actually, it's not just the state, it's national. But California, the governor, Newsom, declared an executive order embracing 30 by 30, which means by the year 2030, we should be preserving about 30% of the land and water. Well, here's the catch. It's seawater that they're talking about when we really need to be protecting 30% of the fresh water. But because that's politically fraught, it's off the table. So Newsom's going to try and take it out on the marine resources. And the question becomes, right now, if I'm not mistaken, I think about 18% of our coast is tied up in marine protected areas, which means he's got another 12% to go. Under the 30 by 30 rule, will that other 12% have to be marine protected areas? Could it be a level of protection that's somewhat slightly less, like marine sanctuaries, where some types of fishing is allowed? And I think the fishing industry has argued that it'd be good to consider other types of protections. Critical habitat is one of them. Marine sanctuaries is another one. They don't all have to be MPAs, is the bottom line. But you're going to see this tug of war play out over the next few years, I suspect.
John, thank you again for a fascinating presentation. Really appreciate you being here with us tonight. And thank you all for joining John. Much appreciation.